we've very much all been counting over the past 118 days, for this to come to a resolution. It looks like we're very much there now. So late yesterday, the negotiating committee of the SAG-AFTRA union approved terms that were put to them by the studios and have recommended those to the board. There'll be a board meeting tomorrow to ratify the deal. And my understanding at the moment is that the increase in the terms of the overall deal add up to about $1 billion. So it's a very significant win on the actors' side, it looks like. They also sought very robust protections as it relates to the use of artificial intelligence concerning the actors' likeness. So more details of the deal will come out tomorrow once it's been ratified by the board at the meeting.
So, Thomas, you're saying this is a win for the actor side, but we see Disney stock up substantially in a down market. Obviously, this has to be a positive, and that's before we even start looking at Netflix or Apple or Amazon, anyone else with an interest in this. Why did this take so long to reach this agreement? Was this a win-win?
It's a very good question. I think it certainly is a win overall for the town. I mean, Hollywood has been desperate to get back to work ever since the writers walked off the job back in May, seeking better terms in their own contract. The DGA, which represents the directors, was able to get more favorable terms, and there was no need for a strike there, they argued. And then the actors themselves walked off the job in July. And since then, the vast majority of Hollywood productions, be they TV or film, if they're not independently produced, have been shut down. So that's impeded really a ton of titles from progressing over the summer and ended up imperiling much of the autumn season for TV and the blockbuster season as relates to theatrical films for next year. So I think there is an immense sigh of relief that everybody can now return to the job really as early as today, given that the strike on the actors' side ended at 12:01 last night. I think that the reason why we're also seeing Disney stock up is obviously that they had decent results yesterday, which is really driving a lot of the equity story there today.
Yeah, I want to talk more about Disney in just a few minutes, Thomas, but I want to make sure we hit every constituency here. So we just had Barry ask you about the companies. You talked about the workers. What about people like me who, after a long day at work, want to go home and stream something on Hulu, Netflix, or HBO? I guess I got to call it Max now. I'll still call it HBO, though. What happens to the release schedule of everything that was kind of put on hold over the last few months? When does that start to trickle out and hit the platforms?
Well, look, it's going to be very interesting to observe that. I mean, certainly on both the streaming side and on the theatrical release side, a number of people are going to be playing around with their schedules, maybe seeking better dates to accommodate productions that are going to be wrapping up later than planned, and really strategizing around what are the best titles to put out either as soon as possible if they're complete, those that will benefit from being promoted by the actors in them. There's going to be a number of conflicts, I think, certainly in trying to get actors both promoting existing titles and also shooting upcoming titles. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, even as early as yesterday, we saw in the immediate aftermath of a deal being announced, Sony moved their Venom title by a few months. And I think it remains to be seen exactly what the film slate looks like for next year on the basis that it's not necessarily fixed. I think a lot of studios will still be evaluating whether the current dates they've set for their titles still make sense for them.
So what do you make of what's been going on in the movies that have been out? We've seen some giant blockbusters. You had Oppenheimer, we had Barbie, we had Top Gun, and now the new Taylor Swift movie. But between those tentpole films, it's kind of been a vast wasteland. What does it say about the future of cinema as entertainment?
It's a very good question. I think, you're totally right to say that obviously there were some huge blockbusters over the summer with Barbie from Warner Brothers and Oppenheimer from Universal really being standout films. Certainly as it relates to Barbie, that was, about $1.4 billion in box office receipts, which is really, Warner Brothers' most successful film in its 100-year history. So the summer hasn't been without success stories. That being said, as you rightly point out, since then, it's been a little bit of a drier affair. And I think that without the actors being on hand to promote the films either in press interviews or at red carpet premieres, it's been very difficult to build up the amount of buzz that's needed for these films to really travel properly.
So I want to go to, really thinking about the potential long-term effects of this. Were there any habit changes, or will we know if people change their habits as a result of I mean, I think this is more about the writer's strike and less about the actor's strike. But given that we had, and it's all a similar labor story, Thomas, but given that we had such a long break from late night comedy shows, the late night talk shows, a lot of investment went into the reality shows. I'm wondering if we're going to start to see any sort of long-term habit shifts as a result of this, people moving away from watching those things that were off air for so long.
It's an interesting question. I mean, certainly the same dynamic was observed, during the writer's strike of the late aughts, back in 2007, 2008.
But there were fewer alternatives then. There wasn't, you couldn't go to Netflix, you couldn't go to Hulu then.
That is certainly true, but nonetheless, you did see a surge in investment in reality TV shows, and reality TV really had its moment, I think, in the back half of that decade, when everybody thought, you know what, this is where the future is and the money to be made, and it's also a very good insurance policy against future strikes. The truth of it is, I think there's still a huge amount of appetite for scripted content, and as a result of that, people will tend to gravitate back towards it, even after a period of reality TV shows. I think the difference, as you very rightly point out this time around, is that the sheer availability of existing content on streaming services meant that people actually thought, you know what, despite there not being anything necessarily new out this week on the basis there is a writer's strike, I can nonetheless catch up on all the scripted content that I've been meaning to catch up to and wasn't able to over the past couple of years, given that we were still in the tail end of what I suppose you could call peak TV, with a volume of shows that is simply unprecedented for all of us to catch up on.
So Thomas, let's break some hearts and tell some secrets. Reality TV is often called unscripted TV, but those of us who work in the business,
say it ain't so.
It turns out to be surprisingly scripted. How were they able to get around a writer's strike when everything you see is edited, manipulated, structured, based on some showrunner driving the narrative, driving the storyline?
So that I couldn't possibly answer on the basis that I'm not on the sets when these decisions are made. That being said, maybe everybody involved in a quote-unquote reality TV show was given their briefing notes and storylines early on in the process and knew exactly which line to drag. But that's purely an assumption on my part, and I'm speculating now. So, yeah, with the absence of actually sitting on these sets, I couldn't possibly know.
Okay, Thomas, give me 30 seconds on Disney. I promised we'd save a little bit. You wrote the story on earnings. You were on the call yesterday. We know about the cost cutting. Give us your take day two.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, so Bob Iger has pledged to cut an extra $2 billion out of the business, bring the total tally of cost cuts on an annualized basis to $7.5 billion. And I think that what it really does is it complicates the narrative for billionaire activist investor Nelson Peltz, because it seems as though Bob has really taken an approach now to favor operational gearing to get the company back to growth. And so I think that it complicates the narrative for an activist investor to come in and say, look, this is what I do differently, because it seems as though at this point, Bob is trying his best to activate from within.